What's up, ladies and gentlemen? My name's Scyushi, and I'm going to do the best that I can to explain just how awesome Samurai Bringer is and why you should probably pick this game up. At least if you have a controller or if you're buying this game on consoles, because it doesn't have the best mouse and keyboard support. Now, this has been just a godsend. Like, I didn't know that this game was going to end up being as awesome as it is. It's pretty much going to end up being one of my favorite roguelikes. This is comparable to Dead Cells and Risk of Rain 2 in my eyes, because what Samurai Bringer brings to the table, if you'll excuse the pun, is one of the most unique combat systems I've ever seen in any video game, let alone a roguelike. So let me actually just hop into my file here, and I'll try to end up explaining the basics of the roguelike aspect of the game, and then we'll end up talking about the combat system itself. So right now, you see, I've already been playing this for quite some time. I've got quite a bit of HP, I got quite a bit of SP, and I'm playing as this really cool samurai guy and stuff, right? So essentially, as you're playing through the game, there's going to end up being these various enemies that you can come across. So this is going to end up being kind of a smaller general enemy, right? And when we end up fighting this guy, he's going to end up being decent, but he's not like super duper powerful. He's going to end up most of all having a chance to drop a key, which we can then end up using to open some of the chests. So you can see that there's one over in the distance to the north, which we'll go to in a moment. But every enemy is also going to end up having a chance of dropping these combat scrolls, which we'll get into those momentarily. But essentially the combat scrolls are going to, there's a key right there. They're going to quite literally allow us to program different abilities into our character. Now we've actually got a bunch of special generals showed up, right? So I'm going to start using a lot more of my attacks. These guys are going to end up being a little bit more difficult for me to face. They just generally speaking are going to end up being a lot stronger unless I can break his guard. Okay, cool. So we're not going to fight the other ones yet, but when you end up killing these unique generals, you essentially are going to end up unlocking them as a character that you can then end up selecting on your next run. So that's why I'm actually already look like this and look really, really cool and end up having, you know, a couple basic pieces of equipment and so on and so forth, right? But I ended up killing this general. So now I can pick up his item. Now, all the armor and weapons do in the game is quite literally give you a different passive ability. So essentially, when you pick a general that you can start as when you go out into your adventure, you're essentially only going to end up getting one passive buff at the start. And now you can see, okay, so deal more damage the more barrages you execute. Okay, cool. We definitely want to end up equipping that. I can equip this guy's piece of gear in any slot that I choose, including the weapon slot. So you can see right here, now we've got a different spear. Or maybe I don't want that as my weapon. Maybe I want it as, you know, my gauntlet or my chest armor or even as my helmet, right? The point is that you can truly customize which passive abilities you end up having in specific slots. And the reason why this is important is because certain generals, you can see the Susanoo armor right here. This is going to end up basically being our default character. You can see that on the right side, it is actually going to end up being a different weapon. So if I equip it in my weapon slot, now suddenly I've got a sword and a spear. And you can essentially end up dual wielding all of the different weapons in the game. And some of the weapons will end up actually changing how your character will function with the specific combo moves and attacks that you end up having programmed to the character. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Essentially, all you end up losing in this game when you die, because it is a roguelike meaning that if you die, you end up restarting at the beginning, all we're going to end up losing is this passive armor. So it's actually not a very punishing game in terms of, you know, just the progression system and how the roguelike is, because a lot of times roguelikes are going to end up being very, very mean and end up restarting you completely at the beginning with no stats or anything like that, right? However, there's going to end up being these Torii gates that you can come across, which I'll end up inserting some footage because I don't have one in front of me right now. And essentially, these will end up being puzzles, parkour challenges, so on and so forth. And they can end up, if you complete them, they'll end up essentially giving you permanent stats. You'll also get permanent stats from just doing other things in the game, fighting certain bosses and so on and so forth, right? And the permanent stats are going to end up ranging from increasing your max health, increasing your maximum mana, but also, more importantly, it's going to end up increasing your combative slots. So, for example, at the beginning of the game, you're only going to be able to associate one slot towards the jump action, right? And you can see these are going to end up being all of those scrolls that I talked about where I ended up finding them off of enemies. However, just to give you guys a little bit of a taste, if I end up going to the second slot on the B button, what do I want that to be? Okay, well, let's just do something simple. Let's put jump. right? So now I essentially have given myself a double jump. Pretty cool. And you're going to notice that the ability itself is going to end up draining a certain amount of my SP, or my mana, or my stamina, which is in the top right corner of the screen. It's 1 out of 33 slots available, because as you're playing through the game, you're going to end up essentially unlocking more and more slots that you can end up putting different abilities on. So I can, now that I'm so far in the game, 8 jump actually right now, which I still can end up unlocking more abilities, because I think these actions can end up going up to 10. But now suddenly you see that I can basically just keep jumping into the air, right? But these aren't going to end up being super duper efficient, because these jumps are going to end up only having 1 scroll associated with them. So if I suddenly just start pumping jumps into this, you'll see that I now have 8 jump, which is the maximum of this particular scroll that I can end up putting in this slot. It means that it's going to end up taking 8 SP instead of 1, but you'll notice that my first jump, if I hold down the button, I'm jumping significantly higher than all of these other baby jumps afterwards, right? So that's kind of where the complexity comes into place, because you can do all of the same actions with all of these scrolls. Every single one of them. So let's say right now, okay, I got slice, reverse slice, slash down. Well, this is going to end up being the base combo right now, but I can always end up putting in more slice if I want. And as you can see, that's going to significantly increase the damage that I'm doing. My attack is now at like 562 for the, for the basic slice, but it's going to end up costing a lot more SP. It means that my attack is also going to end up having a different animation as well, because now this is a much heavier hit. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to have this at the beginning of my combo. I would more than likely want to have that somewhere near the end or somewhere in the middle to break it up, right? Now, where this game goes big mode is the fact that not only can you end up equipping multiple of one specific type of scroll to end up increasing the action of that attack, you can also mix and match it with all sorts of other things. So if I end up just putting step, which is basically going to end up being our dash, I put that into my slice move, and now suddenly I step forward ever so slightly before I end up starting my combo. Now, if I end up changing my base attack into a thrust and I set it to 4 thrust with 5 step, just so that I end up dashing a little bit more forward, right? But then we're also going to end up using one of these modification scrolls, which is going to be Samidare, which attacks hit multiple times consecutively. So I'm just going to show you guys an example of this. This is now our base attack, and we end up dashing forward and stabbing, and then the Samidare is going to end up doing that additional attack that you see coming right after, right? Cool, huh? Now, let me actually unequip my right-hand weapon so that I only have 1 spear. I haven't changed this attack. It's basically going to end up being the exact same that I just showed you 2 seconds ago. However, now that I'm using a one-handed weapon, the attack animation and functionality of it has completely changed, which is so freaking cool, dude. And this is just showing you guys a very base example of one weapon type, okay? Because if I end up changing over to a sword, the functionality is going to be completely different, where now I'm actually thrusting forward in a big stabbing motion. And on top of all of that, there's all sorts of things that you can end up combining. You can end up putting a elemental attack to it. So now suddenly when this ends up tagging enemies, it's going to end up setting them on fire. Maybe I also want to end up making myself more invulnerable to damage, because of course that is going to end up being an attack that leaves me quite vulnerable, because if I dash into an enemy, it just leaves me wide open for an attack. So I'm going to end up essentially just putting a bunch of power on this, which prevents recoiling from damage and forcibly makes you become able to move. So now suddenly it's basically the exact same combo, but now I can't get interrupted while I'm in the middle of doing it. And by putting more power scrolls onto it, it essentially means that I'm going to end up making myself less and less susceptible to being knocked down while I'm doing this attack. Let's move on to something a little bit more basic. So now suddenly we've got the bow right here, and we've got 3 of these scrolls, which means that we're essentially going to end up shooting 3 arrows. However, if we end up putting it up to 8, now suddenly we're shooting out a ton of different arrows. But on top of that, we can end up going even further. We can end up putting guidance into it, which essentially is going to end up making these homing, and then we're going to end up putting lightning as well. So now suddenly we've got homing lightning arrows that are going to end up shooting all over the place. So let's get rid of the bow attack, and instead we're going to end up using the ability of manipulate, which combine with other skills to control weapons with your mind. So quite literally, if we end up putting to manipulate. It means that we can end up thrusting with our sword, and essentially we're going to end up now throwing our weapon out of our character. Now, on top of all of this, later in the game, you actually end up getting a sub-weapon slot, which essentially makes it so that at any point, you can end up putting this sub-weapon scroll onto this, which is going to make it so that now our Y attack is actually going to end up using our alternative weapon. So you can see that we're actually swapping from one spear to another. Let me actually change this to the sword so that I can show you guys a little bit more obviously, right? So we're attacking with the sword now. So what you can essentially do with the sub weapon is you would essentially be able to add it into a combo later on, because maybe you want to end up having one specific function of either having a single weapon or maybe dual wielding a different type of weapon, right? Like, let me show you guys another really cool example. So if we get thrust and add a little bit of jump, wave, power, and poison, now we've got this stabbing motion with our attack, right? However, if I end up putting 4 jump into this, it's actually going to end up changing the functionality. So now we leap into the air and thrust our weapon into the ground and essentially end up having an area of effect of poison. And the reason why we have the area of effect is because wave is going to end up being AoE attacks, power is going to end up making us invulnerable to enemy attacks when we're using the ability, and poison is going to end up being the effect that is going on the ground. So we can essentially end up doing weird combos like this, where I actually just moved my right trigger ability here, and then we'll end up having our jump thrust down with the spear. So we have this set to our sub weapon, which essentially is going to end up being our sword. So now we can throw our sword out, and if I press the button again, we will end up doing this attack right after. Now, if we can take a quick break from the combat, because I think that I've explained basically everything that we need to know about it. The roguelike aspect of the game is most of all going to end up being, you can see in the top right, that's going to end up being a portal that will advance us to the next floor, which essentially ends up having us fight stronger enemies and potentially fighting new generals. And the reason why you want to fight new generals is because you're going to end up unlocking them as pre-built characters, which I'll show you guys momentarily. However, these purple portals are essentially going to end up being the main brunt of the game's progression system, where we're going to end up being knocked into the demon realm, where we can then end up facing a very strong samurai opponent, which I'll try and beat him just with these base abilities. I don't really have everything super duper set up. And as you can see, he's tagging me with fire, which actually I think I'm just tagging myself with fire, aren't I? Yeah, I am. Okay. Well, let me actually swap that out. Instead of having flame, let's swap that to poison, because yes, you can get tagged by your own effects if you don't have the resistance to it. So you can see that we have the poison resistance, so we're not going to take damage from poison attacks, whereas this guy is going to end up getting his butt kicked. Now, there's going to end up being multiple demon bosses that you can end up fighting throughout the game. This is just going to end up being kind of a preliminary, right? And now we're actually going to fight the main boss of this area, which is going to end up being the demon, or the, you know, Oni, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. Actually, you can't, because my face cam is kind of blocking it. But you see these little, they look like 9s right in front of me? That essentially is going to end up being a half of a yin-yang that will end up essentially being... you get 1 for every Oni you end up fighting, and you have to beat every single one of the Onis before you can end up fighting the final boss, which is going to end up being this crazy serpent dragon thing that essentially ends up fighting you at the beginning of the game and knocks out all of your powers and all of your abilities. But I'm just going to let this thing kill me, just so that I can show you guys what the hub area is going to end up looking like. Unfortunately, it sure is taking a long time for this thing to kill me, and the reason for that is you'll notice that there's this timer in the top right, where, there we go, where we're slowly progressing throughout the days in game, and essentially the longer you end up taking, the more the enemies are going to scale. So if you can end up essentially fighting these Oni as early as possible, they're essentially going to end up being at their weakest scaling, right? But you'll see right here, we died and we ended up losing all of the gear that we ended up finding, which is not a big deal because we still got to keep any passives that we would have made on the run. And as I mentioned, you're going to end up unlocking different generals as you end up playing through the game and as you defeat these generals, right? Now, the real crazy thing is that even though there's this super complex combat system where you can end up designing basically all of your abilities as much as you want, you could very easily take one of these generals and they are going to end up having their own starting basic attacks and moves. So you can see this guy's got this as his right trigger, and this is going to end up being his heavy attack or his Y button move, right? So you can kind of just pick and choose which ones do you like the best, which abilities do you like the best, and essentially what you can also end up doing is studying their attacks. So you can end up being like, okay, well, this is a slice wave power, and then that's going to end up having that effect with this specific weapon. Well, what does it end up doing if I dual wield? Oh, it doesn't let me dual wield in town, but the point is that you can truly end up experimenting and learning about the combat system through just taking these characters, right? And they're going to end up having all sorts of different moves that have very, very different functions. And it's really, really cool, and it's really, really in depth. And I have nothing but good things to say about this game. I've just been absolutely addicted to it just because this sheer amount of combos that you can end up pulling off with these guys. Like, look at this. Look at this. Look at how much more complicated this all is with this character, right? And then I guess I should also mention these Buddha statues. Essentially, while you're playing through the game, you are slowly unlocking achievements. So you can see I've actually got quite a few of them built up right now that I didn't claim. And all of those yin-yang halves that went into my character was essentially giving me different passive permanent buffs. So my SP increased, the amount of attacks that I could associate has increased, and so on and so forth, right? So highly recommend this game. I think it's just one of the best games that I've played in a very, very long time. And I really feel bad that this game doesn't have as much exposure as it does. I definitely plan on playing this game on the channel, but I wanted to end up having kind of... I don't know how much I could end up getting away with playing this game on the channel, but I wanted to have like a video that was more instructional and letting you guys know just how complex this system is and just how thoroughly impressed I am that a game like this can exist and only be $10. The only things that are kind of missing from the game, I would say, is multiplayer would be great. And while you can kind of save these specific scroll abilities or loadouts, you have to actually associate them with custom scrolls that you can end up earning while you're out on your run. But I would much rather prefer if I could just select this specific function and just say, okay, I want to save this, right? Rather than having to, you know, it's very convoluted to have to go and unlock a custom scroll. And then on top of that, you have to manually add all of these different actions to it. You can't simply copy and paste. Anyways, I'm going to try and cut this down, this video down for you guys to be something a little bit more reasonable. And I hope you guys ended up enjoying. As you can see, I've been playing this game like crazy with all of these different generals unlocked. I don't have all of them yet, but I'm getting there. Smash like, sub for more, buy the merch you want, support the channel. I'll put links in the description to where you can end up grabbing this game as well if you're interested. But I do gotta give you guys another quick reminder that this game is best played on a controller. It doesn't really have the best mouse and keyboard controls.